Hi, I'm Sleep Aid, and today we'll be taking a look at A Fool's Errand, a webtoon by Pow Pow Potato. And if you would like to submit your comic for review, you can do so on the Reddit post, which is linked in the description. I'll be reviewing them in the order they were submitted in, so it may take a little while to get to any new ones. But let's have a look at A Fool's Errand. I will start by reading the description, and then we will dive right in. It says, a missing sister, an attempted murder, and a magical tower inhabited by someone who promises Annie a way out of the mess she's caught in. The price? The knowledge of where she lives. But Annie couldn't go home anyway, not without finding her better half, Fran. Together with a boy she meets along the way, they sets out to find her. Soon, they discover they both can see spirit-like creatures, and the magic doesn't stop there. Each night, new clues appear, seemingly from Fran herself. Okay, and this is a fantasy drama, as it's labeled. I do want to point out that most of what is mentioned in the description here does happen over the course of the 12 currently existing episodes, but some of it doesn't. And so, I do think that it might be worth adjusting the description to just kind of be a little bit more vague and general, because it kind of is explaining the generic sequence of events, but there are a lot of things, or there are a few things here anyways, that don't actually happen in these first 12 episodes, and so maybe the description is being a little too specific, I think, because it's kind of giving away things that haven't even happened yet. And so, generally, I would say that everything in the description should happen pretty quickly in a story, probably in the first 3 or so episodes, but it feels like a lot of this probably could be trimmed down, reduced, and just kind of made more generally about what the plot is about. Okay, sorry, so let's go ahead and get into it. Now, as the description explained, this is a story about a girl that is looking for her older sister and gets wrapped up in a misadventure involving spirits and criminals and all sorts of things. There are only 12 episodes so far, but a lot of things do happen over the course of those 12 episodes, and almost too many things. It tends to move very quickly at times and slowly at others, and so I think that this is the type of story that has a lot of really interesting ideas presented, but maybe doesn't necessarily know how to utilize those ideas or how to work them in, and so it kind of feels like a lot of rough drafts that are put together, but it's missing a little bit of the connective tissue to make it really feel like a flowing narrative, and so it's really difficult to describe the purpose of the story because it almost seems a little bit aimless. And so, as I said, the main character is Annie, who is looking for her older sister Fran, who disappears on her way to the train station on her birthday to greet one of the guests. And Annie goes looking for her at a cafe near to the train station where they had previously spent time, and so she finds a letter left by Fran explaining that Fran overheard 4 men having a suspicious conversation and decided to follow 2 of the men to see what they were up to, and so Annie goes pursuing those same men and ultimately ends up taking the train to another town over, where she does find the men, and they are clearly talking about criminal activities. She considers calling the police, at which point the men notice that she's there. Simultaneously, she bumps into the male lead, Wilbur, who just happens to be standing there. And the two of them are abducted after one of the criminals attempts to shoot Annie, but doesn't hit her, but she passes out anyway, and so they abduct her instead of killing her, and then they take her back to some kind of safe house where they imprison her with Wilbur, where they then attempt to kill her anyway, but spirits intervene and prevent them from killing her, and she escapes into a magical tower that has appeared in the middle of the city, where a godlike being offers her the choice between learning the location of her sister or saving Wilbur, whom she at this point doesn't really know, and is kind of only reciprocating him having attempted to save her earlier. And so she saves him in exchange for a memory. She's not sure which one it's going to be, and she finds out later that it was the memory of where her home is. And so the sequence of events is a little bit difficult to follow because it jumps around a lot, and so random elements are kind of brought into the plot at strange times, and it doesn't really feel like there's a really solid plan for this story. It kind of meanders a lot, and it's constantly adding more and more elements, which makes it a lot harder to understand what's going on. But I think that a story like this can work with all these different strange elements mixed together. It's a late 1800s story about a girl searching for her sister, getting involved with some shady criminals while being aided by various spirits, some malicious, some friendly. I think that can generally work, but I feel like some of the plot elements that are brought in need a little bit more setup. They need a little bit more time to breathe and a little bit more clarification so that we, the reader, kind of have time to process them and understand what the rules are. So, as an example, the spiritual element. So there's the first episode is a prologue of sorts. It's a stinger, a flash forward to the deal that she makes with the godlike being. But then the second episode is just introducing her relationship with her sister. It's a very mundane thing where the two of them interact on Annie's birthday. And in the third episode at the end of the third episode, is where it's introduced that she can see spirits, and it's kind of brought up in a very random way at a very random time, and it doesn't really feel like it's explained as well as it could be explained. And there are a lot of little asides like that, where an element kind of just gets introduced at an odd moment and feels like it isn't fully set up, which can also at times just make things more confusing. And speaking of confusing, I mean, I had to kind of double back on dialogue quite a bit to make sure that I understood what was actually meant to be going on, what we were actually talking about, because, for example, the first episode, chapter 1, well, it's the second upload, but it's the first chapter. It's a flashback to Annie's birthday, which is meant to establish the relationship that she has with Fran and also kind of her outlook on life. And it's very well done, and the art is nice and flowing, and there are these little abstract elements and these vignettes, and all of that stuff is very nice. It's a very fun comic visually. There's a lot of interesting things to look at, and I appreciate that the artist doesn't shy away from drawing these big landscapes and these wide shots with, again, oftentimes cuts to abstract work that kind of accentuates it and gives it a almost storybook feel, and that's very nice. But yeah, we spend the first episode, Annie is reminiscing on her birthday, only for it to be revealed that it's actually Fran's birthday at the beginning of the story, and so we're kind of cutting from one birthday to another birthday, and like that juxtaposition is almost confusing because we don't really have a pre-established relationship with these characters yet. We don't really know them yet, and so when we have two birthdays happening in the same episode, one being a flashback, the other being the inciting incident for the plot, it kind of muddies the waters a little bit and makes it a little bit harder to follow. It's just one of those things that it almost feels like it's overcomplicating what should be a relatively simple presentation. And yeah, I think that's probably a good way to describe the entire narrative experience, is just that it feels a little bit more convoluted than it needs to be, because if you put all the events in sequence chronologically, you can kind of follow them, but they're presented in a way that makes it seem more confusing than it actually is. And probably my biggest criticism for the writing of this would be, it's often not clear why characters are doing what they're doing. So, for example, we don't actually know why Wilbur is standing out in the streets of this town when he happens to bump into Annie, and he approaches her and asks her if she's all right because she's been standing here for a while, at which point he finds out that she's watching the two criminals that are actually searching for him, or rather his father, because they have had a business falling out with their shady business, and now they're supposed to be killing his father, getting rid of him. But it isn't really clear why Wilbur is here in this moment, why he runs into Annie at all, because we find out in a later chapter that his dad runs a pharmacy in London. And I'm not really sure why. Like, there's so many moments like this where I'm not really sure why the characters are in the places that they're in, or why they're doing the things that they're doing. Why is Annie actually, risking her own safety to follow these two obvious criminals across multiple routes of the railroad, multiple towns, in search of her sister, without ever informing anyone else what she's doing, where she's going, or why? It just doesn't seem like something that she should be taking on alone. And it's possible that it's just a bad decision that the character is making. That's sometimes true, but it also feels like it isn't really explored in the way that it's presented, and so I can't tell while reading it if it's just the character making a bad decision, or if it's something that wasn't considered during the writing process. And so it's important that when a character is doing something they shouldn't be doing, or making a mistake, it's kind of important to make it clear that it is a mistake being made on the character's part, and not just a mistake on the part of the writing. And so, yeah, that's kind of something that I, again, see a lot, is I'm not really sure why the characters are doing the things they're doing a lot of the time. And, for example, the two criminals, one of them attempts to shoot Annie. She passes out at the sound of the gun, but doesn't actually get shot. It's revealed afterward that she wasn't shot, but she fainted. And the goal of the criminals was to eliminate her as a witness, because they don't want anyone to know what they're up to. And so she's a liability, but it isn't clear why they take her with them instead of just killing her like they had intended to anyway. And I suppose these last panels kind of imply that the spirit is the one that saved her from the bullet. I guess that's what that's meant to imply. Again, it's just little things like that where it's kind of confusing at times what's actually going on. And then we don't really know why she's able to see the magic god tower in the middle of town, or how she's able to interact with it. It isn't really delved into in detail, and the character Annie doesn't really react to it very strongly. She kind of takes it in strides. She accepts it with very little question and goes along with it, but it feels like something that should be rather fantastical. And so, again, it's one of those little things where it can be hard to tell what the characters are thinking and why they're doing the things that they're doing, why they're reacting in the ways that they're reacting. It's, I think it comes across as though the ideas for the scenes were made up without necessarily the motivation for the character being made up at the same time, and so the scenes are made to play out a certain way because that's how they were envisioned, but even if it doesn't necessarily match what the character would logically do in that scenario, it's kind of just pushed to happen anyway by the writing. And so it just, yeah, I feel that the more of it that I read, the more I was left with questions that felt unanswered. There were a lot of just oddities about the way the story progresses and the sequence of events. It's the type of thing where it's, I don't know the exact quote offhand, but it's a style of writing where essentially what we're getting is this happened, and then this, and then this, and then this, whereas you really want a narrative to read as this happens, therefore this happens, and thus this happens, and so the event should really lead together, and so the earlier events of the story should set up the later events, but there are a lot of times in this one where it kind of just feels like things are just happening, like things are just kind of happening that aren't necessarily related to each other. It's just that something needs to happen next, and so something random kind of happens. And then there are a few little nitpicks I have about not just the art, but like not really the art. This moment here, this one in particular, I stopped here for a reason. So when our character Annie first leaves the house to go search for Fran, it's raining, so she brings her umbrella with her, and when she escapes from the criminals to the magic tower, she softens her fall while jumping from a balcony, about 32 steps up, they say, jumping from a balcony with her umbrella, but it kind of just appears out of thin air because it disappears after she's done using it the first time, and then it reappears later, and so it feels like a bit of a continuity break, as though the creator kind of forgot to draw the umbrella for all those intermittent episodes, but the umbrella is needed again here, and so it just kind of appears, and it's not really set up or established, it's just there, and so it's one of those little details that it's just a bit scattered. And the other nitpick I had, this is a personal pet peeve of mine, it's not necessarily a criticism of the comic itself, it's just something that I don't like personally, is this is a period piece, and so it's written to be happening in the late 1800s. I think based on the birth date given for the character, it should be 1898 or 1899, one of those, but it's the very end of the 1800s. The dialogue is written in a very modern way, and so the way that people speak in 1800s London, 1800s United Kingdom, is very, very different from the way that people talk today, 100 and almost 30 years later. But all of the dialogue in this comic is written in a modern style with modern slang and modern diction, and so that's something that always stands out to me whenever I read something that's set in an older time period. Is just that I like to see the older style dialogue, because it feels very strange to see characters in 1800s costumes using modern slang. Now, again, that's just a stylistic decision. That's not necessarily a criticism. That's just something that's one of my preferences personally. I know a lot of people are kind of split on that, because it is easier to read and understand when the dialogue is written in a modern way, whereas a lot of 1800s slang is forgotten today, and people don't necessarily know what it means, and so if you were to use 1800s dialogue, it would be harder to understand, but I don't know, I just kind of enjoy that type of thing, personally. So yeah, I think that I would say that overall the best part of this series so far is the art and the visuals. I think that the visual style is very fun to look at. I like the way that different scenarios are conveyed with abstract imagery, and I like that it's often morphing the reality a little bit to kind of demonstrate certain points and emphasize different things. It's very, very pretty artwork to look at, and that makes it very fun to read. But I do think that the story is a little bit hard to follow, and the point of it kind of gets lost about halfway through, and you almost forget what the story is about at times because it meanders a lot. And I don't really know what I would recommend at this stage because we're kind of 12 episodes in, and so it's kind of hard to retroactively explain some of these things, but there are a few elements that I just feel like I wish I understood better. Like I wish I understood the spirit side of things a little bit better, kind of what's going on with these little spirits that Annie can see. She says she's been able to see them for her whole life, but we, the reader, we don't really know anything much about them or why they might be helping her or why they might be following her around or what they do. And it's revealed in the description of the comic that Wilbur can see the spirits as well, but again, that hasn't yet happened in the narrative, and so we don't really know what his experience with them has been either. And her, again, meeting the god in the tower is kind of treated very nonchalantly when it feels like it should be more fantastical, and so it kind of begs the question of, is this type of thing normal for her, or is this like the type of thing that happens all the time? Does she have enough experience with the spirit world to where she's not completely freaked out by the magic god tower, or is there something else at play there? And yeah, there's a lot of questions that I am left with reading this, and I feel like there are a lot of elements of the plot that aren't very well clarified, and I think that the literal sequence of events is easy enough to follow, as I've explained a few times. It's just that, again, it isn't always clear what the reason for the events is, why the characters are doing the things they're doing, and so it's interesting to read, it's interesting to follow the story and try to piece it together, but I do feel like there's a lack of depth in the script in a few places that kind of makes it feel like it's a bit underdeveloped on a writing side. And so I would like to see more of it. I think I'm certainly curious where it's actually going and kind of how some of these mysteries will be solved, how some of these events will play out. But I do also think that it's a little bit hard to get invested in the story because it's kind of hard to understand the story. And the author did ask specifically about pacing and dialogue, and so I think that would be kind of my summary of how I feel about the pacing as a whole, is that I think that the events move at a good pace, but I almost wish that sometimes it would slow down and explain things a little bit more to us so that we can kind of understand, again, just why some of these events are happening. But I think this is a comic with a lot of potential, and again, I think this is an artist with a lot of potential. I like the way that a lot of the panels are laid out. I like the approach to the visual storytelling. I think all of that stuff is very good. I just think that the writing could be improved. All in all, I would say it's fairly well made, though. It's been releasing weekly pretty consistently, and so it's clear that there's a lot of work ethic behind this and a lot of passion, and again, I look forward to seeing where it goes. I thought it was a fun read, if a bit frustrating at times, but I think that I have so far been able to understand it well enough. Well enough. I just think that, like I said, there are a few unanswered questions that I have. I'm not really sure how else to explain it. I think I've kind of said the same thing about 5 times in a row, though, so I should probably stop there. So that is a Fool's Errand. It's a fun read, and it is ongoing, and again, it is posting consistently every week. So, as a fantasy 1800s mystery crime drama, it presents a lot of intrigue. So if that sounds like fun to you, definitely give it a look. It'll be linked in the description. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I will see you in your nightmares.